Well, folks are loading in to the event space here. I want to welcome you all to another edition of Reader Meet Writer. I am your host. My name is Wiley Cash. I am the 2019 recipient of the Pat Conroy Legacy Prize from the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance, and I am the writer in residence at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. And as I mentioned, I am your host. I want to tell you a little bit about SIBA before we get started tonight. SIBA stands for the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance, and this is an organization that represents just under 700 independently owned bookstores throughout the Southeast. And perhaps one of those bookstores, like let's say Octavia Books or Lemuria Books or Turn Row Books, one of those bookstores is the reason you are here tonight. You got this link because you're on their email list, you're on their Facebook page, whatever. Please, if you are interested in ordering Fatima's book, please do it from the independent bookstore that brought you here tonight. As a matter of fact, order all of your books from the independent bookstore that brought you here tonight. They are the lifeblood of our literary communities, and they need our support now more than ever. And speaking of support, I want to thank you for being here tonight. You could have done anything. I'm on the coast of North Carolina, and the weather is beautiful this evening. I am hoping it is wherever you are. You could be out doing anything, but instead you are here looking at a screen with us. So thank you so much for supporting authors who otherwise would be at a bookstore or at a library or at a community center or at a university giving a talk very much like the one you're about to see. So by attending these events, you are supporting authors, you're supporting bookstores. Do it with your eyeballs, do it with your dollars, do it with your heart. So thank you so much for being here. I want to let everyone know tonight's event, it'll feature Fatima Shaik, but we have some great upcoming events, including Kate Claiborne. She'll be discussing her new novel, Love at First, on Thursday, March 4th at 7 p.m., a week from tonight. And then Gina Wilkinson will be discussing her novel, When the Apricots Bloom, 2 weeks from tonight on Thursday, March 11th. Both of those events begin at 7. But tonight we have a very special event, and I want to introduce tonight's guest author. And today is the launch day for her wonderful new book, Economy Hall. The reviews have been outstanding. Kirkus, New York Times, everyone is buzzing about this book. So if you haven't checked it out yet, please do. Fatima Shaik was born in the historic 7th Ward of New Orleans and bred on the oral histories told by her Creole family and neighbors. A former assistant professor at St. Peter's University, she worked for more than a decade as a reporter and editor for daily news outlets. Her articles have appeared in the New York Times, The Root, and in these Times. Shaik is a trustee of PEN America and former board member of the Writers' Room in New York City. She is the author of 6 books of fiction, and Economy Hall is her first nonfiction work. So before we begin, we have a video. I want to welcome Fatima, and if we can cue up the video, we'll get started right after that. All right. Wonderful. Fatima, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you being here with us tonight. And we already have some questions and comments coming in. If folks have questions for anything that Fatima says tonight, go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, type in your question, make sure to say your name, Fatima thinks you might have some folks out there that may be some blood relatives or some community relatives. Make sure you say your name and your home bookstore, and I will give Fatima your question at the end of tonight's event. But for now, Fatima, thank you so much for joining us. And can you tell us a little bit about the book in terms of what it's about here as we start?
Thanks, Wiley, and thanks everybody for being here. The book, Economy Hall, is based on 100 years of journals that were in the Economy Society, minutes of their meetings. And it is basically the history of a community from the Haitian Revolution to the start of jazz.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Economy Society, who these people were, what their role was in developing the city, and then on the back end of that, tell us a little bit about your own connection to the city of New Orleans.
Well, these people were men who were prosperous, who were often Creoles. They weren't Creoles throughout, and Creoles basically are people who are non-indigenous people that were born in Louisiana, right, during the colonial period. So these people were shoemakers and blacksmiths and contractors. They organized themselves in 1836 in order to support each other. So their goal was to educate one another, to help one another, and to help suffering humanity. And as time went on, they became much more political because suffering humanity was all around them, and they wanted equal rights. They were literate men, so they began getting very involved in politics and the rest of the world, basically.
Can you tell us a little bit about your connection to the city and why this book spoke to you and why this project spoke to you so much?
Well, it was really an intimate project. It was these were based on the economy journals, or 3,000 pages of minutes from these meetings, right? And my father had them in the closet. So they were in our home. My father's friend was a member of the Economy Society, one of the last members of the Economy Society, and the books were being thrown away. The society was breaking up in around the 1950s, and they were throwing the books away. And he had already put them on the dump truck. And he told my dad, sort of as an aside, maybe you'd be interested in these books. And my dad went there, retrieved the books, put them in the closet. And he said, oh, well, one of these days I'm going to get to them.
Can you tell us a little bit about, I love that story that your dad literally saved these books, you know, from a little bit about, you know, your family and your father, and what was it that interested your dad in these books and in that history? Was there something inside of him that just said, you know, this is a part of the city's history we need to hold on to?
Well, he had grown up in the Sixth Ward, not far from Economy Hall, and his his friends were all people who had been in Louisiana for a long time. They had generations in Louisiana. So he was interested in preserving the culture. He was also interested in research. My father was a real intellectual, but at the time that he was growing up, and part of my time growing up, it was segregated. So he couldn't really go into libraries and he couldn't go into archives like anybody else. So one of the things he did is he kept a library in our home. So whenever he found books or whenever he heard about good books, he put them, like I have books here, he put books in our home library. So when he found out that these books were in French, and my mother read French, I told you a little bit earlier, she was from St. Martinville. So her first language was French, Louisiana French. So they were both interested in reading the books to see what they had to say.
What was life like for you growing up in New Orleans? And do you see any connections between your childhood and some of the things that you discovered while you were writing this book?
Well, yes, I grew up in a very supportive community, a community that had its own organizations. We had our own church. My cousin's father helped build the church. We had schools. We used to help each other all the time. So I found when I was reading these things, in fact, I actually found when the Economy Society started helping Corpus Christi School, when they started building Corpus Christi School, which was the school I went to. So, and that was at the beginning of the 20th century. I found the names of people who lived in my neighborhood. So and these people were in there in the 1850s. I found some of my classmates, the kids I used to hang out with, and their families were there in the 1850s. So this community had pretty much stayed together all of that time. And one of the reasons they stayed together is because they helped each other. So it was natural to me to go to the doctor that my family knew, the Black doctor that my family knew. It was natural to me to go to the grocery store that somebody owned that we knew, right? So, and it was all pretty much in the same area.
Can you talk about whether in your childhood or at the time of the founding of Economie Hall, what were the societal, racial, cultural, political pressures that made it so important for this community to really stick together and really sustain itself and support one another?
Well, in the beginning, in 1836, it was against the law for the enslaved to read and write. So literacy was very important. Literacy was prized. When you read Economie Hall, as I hope you will, you'll find out that there are, I found some slave owners' manuals, basically, that I quote. And one of the things that they say is that education is unsuited to the slave, right? So education was unsuited to the slave because it would not make them a good worker. Once they realized what was going on, once people realize, when anybody realizes what is going on, right? You start to become a little bit more free. For these men who are already free, what the laws, and they were called the Code Noir laws said that they could not conceive of themselves as equal to whites. So even though they could read, they could not even think about whether they were equal or not. So what these men did was ignore all of that. What they did was they started writing minutes. They had a library, and in their library, they had maps of the world. They had books about the organization of the French Republic. They had all sorts of books that brought the world to them. And some of these men actually traveled the world. There were at least 3 that regularly went to France and Italy, and several that went to Mexico, back and forth.
What were they doing on these trips? Were they going and securing other materials? Were they going on vacation? Were they going on, educational explorations?
Yeah, the first time, one fellow, Etienne Codeviol, he had 2 houses. He had a house in France. He had a house in New Orleans. He had a house eventually in Italy. His father was from Italy. His mother was from Africa. And he had homes in 3 places, in 3 countries. So when he went to France, he had a business there. He was a tailor. So he would go to his tailoring business and pick up the fashions and come back and sell them in New Orleans. And on his trip, one of his trips, I think it was in 1836 or 1838, he brought back a bunch of books. They gave him a list of books that they wanted. And when he went there, he got the books and he brought it back.
And I think we know a lot of listeners or a lot of viewers might not have in the front of their minds that Europe was really the seat, in the 19th century, especially in the 1830s, Europe was really the seat of culture, of learning, of kind of an intellectual history. And America was kind of this young, tough, individualist society. And so how did people respond? Or, I know the book just came out, but what should people make of people of color doing the exact same things that like Edith Wharton's ancestors in New York City were doing, which is going to Europe to secure fashion and intellectual histories and all of these things? Is that something that's surprising and to folks? And what kind of role did that play when they would come back to New Orleans and disseminate this information or this fashion?
Okay, that's like 3 things you're asking. First of all, I'm not going to take issue, but I will slightly take issue to Europe being the height of civilization at one time.
Sure.
Okay, because there was a big whirl out there, and my dad, when I was young, always used to say, civilization began in the East and it will return to the East. So, we might be talking about China, So,
sure.
So it was the height of European civilization at the time.
Sure, absolutely.
So they were going to Europe, yeah, just like anybody else. What is surprising about that is that nobody wrote about it, right? That is what is surprising. And it's not so surprising if you look at white supremacy. So, because if you open a newspaper, if you look at the Black newspapers of the time, the Tribune or the L'Union, at the time, you'll see they were writing about it. If you look at the papers in Haiti, they were writing about it. But what didn't pass down to the United States because of white supremacy is the history of people of color. Mm-hmm. So not so surprising,
No, absolutely not. And then when they were returning back to New Orleans, how were they influencing fashion in New Orleans? Were they influencing intellectual histories and the Creole community? how were these trips being shared, or what was the experience like, these far travelers?
There was a quote. Well, first of all, there's an article called "Fashioning Frenchness," and I don't remember the name of the author right off the bat, but she wrote a nice essay about how the fashions of France influenced the women of color in New Orleans, because they sewed their own clothes, and they sewed clothes that would show what part of the society they were in, right? So they elevated themselves by what they wore, and they showed everybody how cool they were, right? The other thing is that I'm laughing at is there was a quote in the newspaper once that said that the establishment of Cordeville and Lacroix, which was the store that this fellow owned, right, had the coats that would make the dandies of the Champs-Élysées blush, something like that, right? So not only did they influence the clothing in New Orleans, they influenced the clothing in Europe. So there was an exchange of ideas that was going on.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, it was great.
So, you spent all these years looking over these documents. I think you said 3,000 pages. What were some things that you found, stories, accounts, minutes of meetings? What were some things that really surprised you? And was there anything that broke your heart, either because of your tie to the community or anything that really shocked you? But what were some surprises you found in these stories?
In the stories themselves, I saw lots of things that led me to other sources. So I saw a lot of activism in these stories, and Ludger Boguille, who is the main person who carries this book. It's a man whose parents were born in Haiti. They came to Louisiana, and he became an activist in Louisiana. He became part of the city council. They were called aldermen then. He became part of the city council. He was part of the Freedmen's Bureau. He ran a freedmen's school. He ran for office. Well, he ran for office, but he was very active. When he attended the Mechanics Institute convention in 1866, it was raided by the police. This was a convention that was created to talk about whether Black men could have the vote. And this was in 1866. The police came in, and they said, I think firemen, but the police came in. They were former rebels, most of them. And they came in and they raided the place, and they just killed everybody in sight. So he was there, and you have a firsthand account from him in that book about what he saw. And he said people were getting shot. The floor was slippery with blood. He tried to get out the door, and when he was trying to get out, the people grabbed the guy that was in front of him and went and killed him. So he was able to escape because they killed the guy right in front of him. So, I mean, that kind of stuff was really heartbreaking. There were other things that were really heartbreaking. While he was working in the Freedmen's Bureau, I remember going to a secondary source that gave the names of all of the children who were orphaned after the Civil War. And that was really hard to read. I remember there was a whole family of children named Green, if the Greens are on this call. There was a whole family of Greens that came in, and maybe the oldest one might have been 9 or 10. And they were all orphans, and they were coming to the Freedmen's Bureau to try to find, I guess, somebody to take care of them, So that sort of stuff would just break your heart when you're reading it, But it's all there. I mean, it's in the book, and it's in the primary sources all over New Orleans.
So this is very obviously a very resilient culture, as you said. This organization built the school that you went to, and so many of the civic institutions in the city that are still maintained were founded by in this cause. Can you talk a little bit about, being someone from New Orleans, what does it mean to you, especially given our political, cultural, historic moment? What does it mean to you to shine the light on such an important foundational history in such an important foundational American city?
Mm-hmm. Well, what it told me by seeing that, it told me that it's really important to create institutions and to support institutions. If you're committed to some cause, you're committed to Black liberation, you're committed, you have to put your money where your mouth is, you have to work with these institutions, and you have to stay there. You have to bring your children into it. You have to keep the institution alive, because there's always going to be someone who decides they don't like you, right? And as we see, you're talking about the political climate, the current political climate, it can go either way. It could go either way. And I think there are enough people who believe in democracy, who believe in equality, to, if they keep their institutions tight, if they keep their progressive ideas, going, that they can move the needle a little bit.
That's a great answer. We have comments and questions already coming in. So if folks out there have questions for Fatima, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And if you get a chance, mention your name and your home independent bookstore. But we had a couple of questions, Fatima, that came in before we even started, came in via email. One reader asks, please comment on the importance of the building contractors. I'm not quite sure how to say that in Creole French. And master craftsmen of the building trades among members of the community.
Well, many of the people in this community in the 7th Ward, many of these people started out in the 6th Ward and in the Faubourg Marigny. So these are, think of the French Quarter. If you walk in 2 directions outside of the French Quarter, you'll see these other communities. These communities came into the 7th Ward. These people, these Creole people, and I'm not, let me just make this one little thing. I'm gonna go one little aside. Lots of people think when you say Creole, you mean light skin, okay? What Creole means is non-Indigenous people. So it doesn't matter what color you are. It matters that your family was born in Louisiana during the colonial period and you're a descendant. That means Africans, that means Europeans, that means people of mixed race, that means people mixed with Indigenous people. Okay, so what you found was a lot of these people were craftsmen. I mean, they had to build a city, right? So they were bricklayers and they were contractors, and a lot of them moved to the 7th Ward. That was my way of getting to the 7th Ward. In the 7th Ward, my cousins were plasterers and bricklayers. I knew people who built their own. In the 7th Ward is full of houses that people built themselves for their families. So there's a huge tradition, the Poiriers, and you could just name a whole bunch of people that were in the Economy Hall and that their families are still carrying out that tradition.
Another reader asks, when did the French language stop being the main language spoken at Economy Hall? Was it a gradual switch to English with resistance from some of its members, or did the change occur abruptly?
That's a good question. It didn't change completely until about 1914. They wrote in French all the way till about 1914. It changed in the 1870s. They introduced English to the members, so they kept their minutes in French, but they also said that they would have an English translation for the English-speaking members, which I never found. Around the turn of the century, Walter Cohen was the president, and he was a secretary for a little while. Whenever he took the minutes, you would see the minutes in English. So near the turn of the century, you would see an occasional secretary who wrote in English, but they kept the French going until 1914, basically.
Speaking of the minutes, Mark says, Mark Charles, yeah, I believe you know exactly who that is. He says, your section on the Black suffrage petition drafted at Economy Hall and signed in January of 1864 is of particular interest to me. My ancestors signed that petition. Unfortunately, the Economy minutes from 1858 through early 1864 are missing. Then the minutes resume on March 1st, 1864. From that point on, is there anything in the minutes that covers the petition?
In a word, no, they don't cover the petition in that. But the petition, let me say this, the petition seemed to be very important to them, not so important to the rest of the country. The men themselves were sort of on to other things by the time they picked up the minutes again. You know, they were coming out of the Civil War. They were trying to get suffrage. Oh no, let me just think. They were trying to get suffrage, but no, they don't mention the petition anymore, really. Many of the people who signed the petition are still active in Economy Hall. The other thing I wanted to tell Mark is that a lot of the things that are happening that are really important are not written in the minutes. What the minutes will say is, we did not come here on, May the 7th because we all know what happened.
Wow.
So what I had to do basically was go look at all of the newspapers for May the 7th to see what happened on May the 7th, right? So I had to look through, I had to look all sorts of things, newspapers and all sorts of sites to see what happened on May the 7th.
Well, it's so funny you said that. We have a comment from Diane Simmons, and Diane says, one of the most remarkable things about this book is the way Fatima holds your hand through the immense and what could have been daunting research by always bringing you back to the Economie Brotherhood, their lives and their works. This is incredibly important bit of research that still manages to read like a novel. Can you tell us a little bit about, I know you've primarily published fiction. This is your first nonfiction book. Can you talk a little bit about how your experience as a fiction writer allowed you to sew a narrative into this amidst what must have been just an incredible amount of research and dot connecting?
It was fun. As a fiction writer, you try to create scenes and you try to create a story out of your senses, right? You see, smell, taste. You go through your five senses in every scene. So what I tried to do was take this research, let's say whatever happened on May the 7th, a riot or whatever, you go there and then you put yourself in the scene and you have to say, well, I know this person died. I know this person got shot. I know this person was put in the police car. What did that smell like? What did that feel like? What did that, sound like? So that's the way what I had to do. So first I had to get all the facts. I had to research and get all the facts, put the facts on one side and then dream about what it smelled like.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that does sound fun.
Yeah,
that sounds much more fun than making it all up.
Kind of, yeah. Kind of is.
And this is a question for me as a fiction writer who's written a little bit of nonfiction, not to this extent, but did you find yourself deep in the research and so enthralled by it that it was hard to pull yourself away from it to start writing?
Sometimes. When it wasn't so close to me, I could look at the research and write it a lot easier. There was a time when I found some documents that had my children's name on them, enslaved children, and it took me about 2 months. I just I couldn't get out of my mind the picture of my children enslaved.
Oh my God.
I couldn't shake it.
We have a comment here from Pamela Tab, who says, your buddy from way back. She says, wonderful talk. Can't wait to read the book.
Good,
looking back on your writing journey, what advice would you give aspiring authors who desire to tell their own community's unique story?
Research first. Even if you're doing fiction, I think you have to always start with research. You have to look and see, you have to look at a good map and see where things were. And then you have to imagine the people, and you have to imagine them in all of their humanity. You can't imagine them as stick figures or stereotypes. I think that's the death of fiction, to imagine people without emotions. So I think it's the death of nonfiction too, to imagine people without emotions.
We have another question from a friend of yours, Harold Dufour, a friend from Boston University, native of Algiers. Harold asks, interestingly, in 1836, Henrietta de Lisle, founder of the Sisters of Holy Family, St. Mary's Academy, drew up the rules and regulations in French for devout Christian women for the purpose of nursing sick and caring for the poor. She had a brother named Jean. Have you found any records related to his contributions to New Orleans Creole culture?
Jean Dufour doesn't ring a bell, but write to me at St. Peter's and give me the name you want me to look up. I'll look and I'll see if I have it.
What about Jean de Lisle? I might have been.
Henrietta de Lisle.
De Lisle, yes. Yeah. Jean de Lisle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Jean de Lisle. Just let me know. I don't remember that de Lisle name. No, I don't remember that de Lisle name being there, but I did find it in Pierre de Lisle, who was one of the founders of Louisiana. So I think I may have touched on some of Henriette de Lisle's family, but by the time they were de Lisle Dupart. By the time Dupart came, by the time the economy started in 1836, and I'm really getting into details here. By the time the economy started in 1836, it started with a Charles Dupart. And I believe Charles Dupart was related to de Lisle's because at one point they were de Lisle Dupart.
Interesting. We have a question from Donald. His bookstore is Octavia down there in New Orleans.
Hey, y'all.
He asks, have you any information on the Black militia from New Orleans between 1815 and 1825 and the general diaspora out of Louisiana to Mexico and elsewhere between 1825 and 1840?
Not so much between 1825 and 1840. Do I have much about a diaspora? I would have to look and see whether I had any individual members that I noted to that. I think Etienne Codeville went to Mexico in those early years, but he came back. I remember him taking a ship over across the Rio Grande. I also, what was his first, about the Battle of New Orleans, guys, the militia?
About the militias, yeah.
The militia, many of the militia members were members of Economie Hall, and they met in Economie Hall when they became a society of veterans, the Société de Veterans. I don't know how to say veterans in French, but the Veteran Society met in Economie Hall weekly.
We have a question from, it's either Jari or Jerry, asks, what were the requirements for admission in the Economie Society? Were there many rituals attached to it?
Hi, Jari.
Jari.
There were requirements for admissions. They had to be of good moral character, and apparently they had to be able to support themselves, and they had to be able to be sort of free enough with their money that they would give money to other people. How they did not write in, I don't remember any other regulations specifically, but I remember those things about them, and they always had a committee who would go out and check the people out. So there was always a committee of 3 who would go look into this person's moral character and their, whether they had a job, whether it was a good job, that sort of thing. Yeah.
We have a question from Lisa. Lisa asks, could you discuss how the men were affected by the white supremacist banks that took away their savings and also their attempts to relocate to Mexico after losing their faith in their future in the US?
Right. Hi, Lisa. I think all my friends got on the thing.
They might have gotten in here.
Yeah. And I don't remember the question. The one question was about Mexico.
And the banks, the white supremacists.
All right. In 1833, Francois Boisderet was one of the members of citizens of the Citizens Bank. Francois Boisderet became a member of the Economie later. His son was a member of the Economie first. What the Citizens Bank did in 1836 is decided that they did not want any more members of color. And Francois Boisderet and another fellow whose name is escaping me right now, they had already become charter members. They were charter members in 1833. So they had to go to court because the bank said, we don't want any more colored members, and we're not going to give you your money for your shares, and you just can't be here anymore. So they would just be wiped out, right? So he went to, they took it all the way up, I believe, to Louisiana Supreme Court, and they won. So Francois Boisderet stayed a rich man. His son, Francois Boisderet Fils Jr., was a longtime member of the Economie, and for a little while he was the president of the Economie. So, wow. Yeah. And then the fellows decided that they wanted to go in 1857. They decided that they were going to immigrate to Mexico, and that kind of fell apart, to answer Lisa's question.
We have another comment from a friend of yours, Desi. Childhood friend from Corpus Christi from the 7th Ward. I can't wait to read your book.
Thank you, Desi.
That's what Desi says. We have a question from all the way up in Concord, New Hampshire, where Gibson's bookstore is. Darlene asks, was there a women's auxiliary and what role did they play? I'm so happy to be listening.
Yeah, thanks, Darlene. There was no women's auxiliary in the Economie Society. Several, Le Candeur had one. There were several organizations later on that had women's auxiliaries. What the Economie women tended to help out in the society. They did have a gardienne, which is like a janitor who lived there for a while, who was a woman, who, by the way, used to cook gumbo for their meetings. And there were some of the daughters that I read later on. The daughters would sew the curtains. The daughters would the daughters made a flag in the 1880s. They sewed up an American flag that they hung outside. So there wasn't an official women's auxiliary, but women did participate in doing things like sewing. They did not come to the meeting. So this was definitely a brotherhood.
We have another question from Cindy, who says, hi, Fatima. Cindy, did your dad ever get to look through all the material he had stored in the closet?
He did. I remember him. I remember because we had this conversation, my dad and I, for most of my life. I mean, that's how I was sort of aware of the stuff in the closet. He looked at it when I was little, and I remember asking him, "Is there anything important in there? Is there anything good?" And he said, "Nah, not much." It was what he had read was the English part. The English part was the easiest and the most accessible because the handwriting was clearer, the books were newer, right? And at that time, they were meeting only once a month. They had sort of lost a lot of their fortunes, so they weren't doing a whole lot. They were supporting institutions like Corpus Christi, like the old folks home. But so was my dad. So he didn't think that was such a big deal.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of the old institutions, here is a question from Linda Broussard. She says, my mother, Almira, is 97 years old, and she remembers how she and her mother, who worked at the Economy Hall, would grate candles for the dances there. What kind of dances were held there during the 1930s?
In the 1930s, I don't have a whole lot in the minutes, but the jazz was there. They were doing jazz dances. I remember interviewing some women who did dance there, and Piron's orchestra was there. I don't know if Piron went all the way to the 1930s, but the Piron orchestra was there. Sidney Desvine was there. Louis Armstrong started there around 1918. And those candles that she's talking about, I don't know if she must know it, her mom knows it. They used to grate the candles because they'd wax the floor. Right? It waxed the floor with the candles. Because I remember Mrs. Blash, one of my friend's moms, who I interviewed a long time ago, said that the floor was one of the nicest floors around. They used to keep it really polished. So that's what those candles were for.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
We have a question from Eileen. This might be our last question, Eileen Bernard. Balto Bernard.
Yeah.
Hello, my old friend, awaiting arrival of my book in Virginia. Congratulations. When did the Economy Society come to an end?
Eileen, I wish I knew. I think it ended around the 1950s. They definitely sold the hall around 1945, and they sold it to a Reverend Avery Alexander. No, it wasn't Avery Alexander. I can't remember. It was a Reverend Alexander. He turned it into a Baptist church, a spiritualist church, maybe Baptist spiritualist, and they still had marches, and the hall stood till the 1960s. But the Economy Society ended, I think, in the 1950s, because that's when my dad's friend was getting rid of the books and getting rid of the furniture.
Mm-hmm. Well, as we close out here, we've still got a number of comments and questions. A lot of people giving you a lot of love and support, which is absolutely wonderful. We had a huge turnout. Thank you all so much for joining us. Fatima, can you talk about some of the events that you've got coming up and talk about how you're bringing in other art forms in celebration of this book that speak to the culture of Economy Hall?
Thank you. I am going to be at Community Books, and don't have my dates right now, but it's in a few weeks. I'm going to be at Community Books, and I'm going to be talking with Jarvis DeBerry about the activism of Economy Hall. And then I'm going to be talking at Garden District Books with Michael White about the music of Economy Hall. Those are two things. And I'm going to be at the Commonwealth Club virtually, talking about Economy Hall in general. So if you come to any of these things, I'm going to be at the Brooklyn Public Library and the New York Public Library. So you come to any of these things, you're going to hear something new.
That's a smart thing to do when you're promoting a book. Activism, music, all that's wonderful. So Fatima, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to all of you out there who tuned in for this really, really important event. Somebody said this should be a series on television. I agree. So if there are any producers out there, we can get you Fatima's contact information for the rights.
I'm ready. Okay.
But have a great night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Wiley.
Of course. Absolutely.